Good morning. All right, so you guys got all this stuff. So I was asked to speak a little bit about trends that are going on, and usually I do this in about an hour, and my time today is about 20 minutes, so this is going to be a version of speed dating. I'd like to call speed data. We're going to go through some things really fast, but what I want to do is actually focus on some of the underlying consumption drivers. So while those have a lot to do with data and numbers, which we're all bombarded with on a daily basis, the thing I want as a takeaway here is to focus on what those consumption drivers are and how you see those every day and the things you're doing with your brands, your customers, and really these things are global, not only in the US as well. So I'm just going to start off with looking at 2016 performance. So the IWSR has been around for about 40 years. We're a specialist analyst and data company focusing only on beverage alcohol. We have data where no data exists. We track actual 9-liter consumption or depletion volume globally with suppliers across beer, wine, and spirits. So these numbers are looking at absolute real depletion or sales volume, not scan data, it's actual supplier figures. My team here in the US right now is working on our 2016 data release, which we do once a year, and it's coming out in the next few weeks. So we're looking at right now the overall spirits category and the growth. We all know that spirits has been successfully stealing some share from wine and beer. Spirits ended up about 2.3% between 15 and 16, up about almost 5 million cases. The trending categories are important here. This is where we're seeing a lot of growth, even on a small basis. We are seeing a significant growth across US whiskey, Irish whiskey, tequila, and cognac. And then some of the brands, no surprise here, that are actually driving a lot of the volume, Hennessy, Fireball, Tito's, and Jameson. As an overview from spirits is approaching about 216 million 9-liter cases, and you can see the growth if you look back 5 years, the trajectory of how spirits is continuing to grow. And if you look at that growth across different categories and percentage share, if we look at whiskey, we see that bourbon or US whiskey, Canadian whiskey are holding a largest share of category in the United States, and then by non-whiskey, vodka is still a significant portion of what we look at for 9-liter case volume and consumption. The things that are driving, and you've heard probably the term premiumization, and I'm going to go over this a little bit more, but where we're seeing the growth is people are drinking not more but better. So premiumization has been a key driver globally, and in the US, it's never been more true. So if we look at the share of spirit sales, and you go back to the 80s, because our data goes back to the 1980s, and you look at the growth of below premium and premium and above, you'll see over the past couple of years, the share of premium and above spirits, and what we forecast for the next 5 years is going to be quite significant in terms of growth. What is driving that growth? And these are some key categories. I have on the right-hand side sort of how we categorize premium and super premium and ultra premium, our quality segmentation for spirits, and then which categories we're seeing growth over the last 20 years, and also projected growth from 1996 to 2021 across tequila, Japanese whiskey, Irish whiskey, super premium gin, right? Everyone always is such a downer on gin all the time. I love gin. I think gin's fantastic. And where we're seeing growth in gin is in premium and super premium imports. US whiskey, of course, Scotch whiskey, and Irish whiskey. So a lot of brown spirits here, but the key takeaway is that ultra premium and above spirits is really what's driving a lot of growth, and we can see that growth continuing. From a wine perspective, overall wine is growing about up almost 2%, and it added about 6 million cases between 2015 and 16. We're seeing a lot of the trending brands, of course, and I'll talk about this in a bit about alternative packaging, but Boda Box and Black Box, of course. And then also sparkling wine is driving a great amount of that growth, of course, driven by the continued trends of Prosecco. Looking at the overview of wine, I mean, it's been 2 decades of continuous growth with wine. Still, wine still makes up about 90% of the actual wine category, but wine right now is approaching about 360 million 9-liter cases, so quite significant. One of the things that we'll talk about in a later slide is how women are actually driving the wine category quite significantly, so it's an important demographic to consider when looking at who your wine customer is. Talking about premiumization in wine. Same thing, you'll see the growth overall in the premium and above wine. I think the colors got a little messed up on the slide, but the top level there is premium and above, so 20.7% 2015, 26.1% in 2020. That's that share of where we're seeing premium and above sort of taking away from below premium. In particular, and if you're following it in the wine category, I think the trend of premiumization, that means really anyone that's spending more than $10 for a bottle of wine. For some of us, that seems like, well, of course, but for the average consumer, spending less than $10 for a bottle of wine has been pretty consistent over the years, and we're seeing now as consumers are becoming much more educated about wine and the type of wine, and we're getting better quality wine and better quality brands, especially from imports from other countries. We're starting to see more and more people willing to broach that $10 bottle of wine mark and going into what we consider premium above wines. Just quickly on beer, because I don't want to leave beer out, and looking at just overall beer. So beer, unfortunately, has been getting its butt kicked a little bit over the past couple of years when we're talking about what's happening with that super premium growth of wine and spirits. So it's always this big conundrum of something we'll talk about called category blur and what's happening with drinkers today. So beer volume right now is slightly declining for 2016. Much of that's happening across domestic, regular, and light. So that's the Buds and the Bud Lights of the world. And they're getting, imports, however, are growing significantly. And that's the Mexican import category, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then, of course, craft, which still makes up a pretty small percentage of the overall beer. It's only about 12%. As much as everyone talks about craft beer, it's still a much, much smaller share of category than you would think. All right, so let's get to the meat of all of this. So what are these underlying consumption drivers that we think are from a global perspective and in the US? So the US is the most important spirits market in the world, right? It drives a lot of the trends. It's where things are happening. It's where people are looking to see some of this growth. So there's 6 underlying consumption drivers. I'm gonna go through most of these, and I've touched on them, but premiumization, category blur, a lot of the demographic shifts, especially with multicultural and female, the healthy living, low and no alcohol. This is kind of the, not to be a buzzkill, but it's a truth and a reality of what's happening with the beverage alcohol industry right now. That desire for experience and connection, and then also convenience and lifestyle. Consumers today are asking, how can you fit into my lifestyle, and what can you do for me? And that's a very, very important thing to consider when you're talking about marketing a brand, packaging a brand, and pricing a brand. So what is category blur? Category blur is about drinking across categories. I've been in this business for over 15 years, and I remember my days at Allied Domecq when we would talk about our Stoli drinker or our Cavassier drinker, and we had a very clear picture of who that person was, and we focused all of our marketing and our sales efforts above the line and below the line, looking at that particular customer. And we weren't worried about if that particular customer was going to be drinking non-vodka drinks or non-cognac drinks, because everyone thought, my customer drinks my brand only. I don't have to worry about wine or beer. That has changed significantly over the years. In particular, consumers now want choice. They want something new and interesting. And it's not unlikely to have, and I'm sure everyone in this room has done this, maybe have a beer, maybe have a glass of wine during dinner, and then maybe have tequila or whiskey after dinner. So most of us drink across categories in one day or one night, if you're lucky, maybe. So this happens, and this is very hard for marketers. You cannot anticipate who your customer is anymore. Your customer is looking across categories. And interestingly enough, you're seeing a ton of brands now, right? I just was seeing something, there's a lot of barrel aging happening, of course, across beers, even in wine. There's a lot of suppliers that are kind of cross-collaborating and doing hybrid products. The whole buzzword right now with bourbon or barrel finished or oak aged is being used across vodka, across beer, across wine, in a way that consumers sort of can look at hybrid products, right? We're seeing a lot of these out in the market. But what's interesting to look at is how men and women drink differently. So this slide's really illustrating, in terms of females, how wine, these are the 4 categories, right? Champagne, sparkling wine, still wine, and liqueurs and cordials. That percentage in terms of female drinkers, for example, for still wine, you saw that it was 90% of the wine category. That's almost 200 million 9-liter cases that are being driven by females, so majority of the wine category. Then you look at what men are drinking, of course, across Scotch, bourbon, and regular domestic beer, and how that influences that percentage of what men are drinking. Then it gets really interesting when you combine all of this data together and you look at the 25 to 34-year-old male and female together, and you say, well, what are they drinking if you combine them together? And then we get a whole different picture. We get Irish whiskey, craft beer, and tequila. So this becomes very, very confusing, right, when you're trying to look at who do I target and what are they drinking? So the takeaway here is to really think about it's almost impossible to try to pinpoint an exact customer because your customers just want something new and interesting. So holding their attention and finding a way that you can make your brand relevant and looking at some of these other underlying consumption drivers is really key. This goes on changing taste. So all of these things kind of, by the time I'm done, you're gonna see how they kind of connect the dots. So the changing taste. So this is what I like to call that smoky, spicy, savory, and strong. So what happened to sweet, right? That used to be a big trend. I had my analysts pull together this slide because I wanted to look at flavored vodkas versus flavored whiskeys. And you can see sort of when Fireball rebranded, used to be Dr. McGillicuddy's, for those of you who don't know that. And then Wild Turkey launched American Honey. So we look at that sort of when that happened and what was going on with this confectionery vodka craze, right? And Pinnacle Whipped sort of launched, and you see that spike at the top. We're actually seeing, of course, these flavored vodkas. The SKUs are getting canceled and going away, and no one's interested in them. And now we're seeing some flavored whiskeys. However, I think a lot of the flavored whiskeys learned from what happened with flavored vodkas, and we haven't seen too many of them, which is actually quite smart. So we haven't seen this huge influx of a ton of flavored whiskey brands, but overall we're predicting that US flavored whiskey by next year is actually gonna overtake flavored vodka. So you can see how this has kind of happened, and everything's a little bit cyclical, but I think the flavor fatigue with consumers with vodka actually really had a big influence in sort of what was happening across the whiskey category. If you ask me what's next in terms of flavors, it's gonna be flavored tequila. So right now we're seeing about 50 flavored tequilas, which is about 6.5% of the overall active tequila brands. When I talk about flavored tequila, it's some of these spicy tequila flavors. There's a lot of different things that are kind of coming out because tequila is a hot segment. As soon as a segment becomes very hot and popular, you immediately start seeing different line extensions where you're seeing different flavor trends in different ways, hybrid products, ways that those brands can actually get a little bit more mileage out of a particular category trend or a brand trend. The other important thing to notice about changing taste is it's driven a lot by millennial multicultural. So that sweet spicy or sweet heat or candy sweet sort of trend. I was starting to look a little bit about Starbucks, right? Every time I go into Starbucks, I see sort of a new flavor, and I was looking at when there was a smoked butterscotch flavor, and I was thinking to myself, okay, that smoke flavor that's very popular now when you're looking at mezcal and the growth of mezcal, which is very smoky. A lot of the spicy sweet heat flavors from sriracha. So there's a big trend that you have to look beyond beverage alcohol when you're looking at what people expect in flavor and taste. So a lot of it's driven by food, and a lot of it's driven by coffee, and there's a big blur in terms of influence. So if you're ever looking for inspiration, I would say go to Starbucks and think about the kinds of flavors. Because if Starbucks is doing a Sheila Mocha, right, that flavor of that spicy sweet chocolate flavor, then you're likely to find that things like that are beverage alcohol is sort of is combined with how that's all working. So that leads on to the Hispanic phenomenon and the influence we're seeing with the Hispanic consumer. So in the US in particular, we know that the Hispanic population in terms of its share of the overall US population is growing significantly. That has a big impact on a lot of categories and growth. So if we look at Hispanic beverage alcohol consumption, we're seeing brands and categories like tequila, cognac, brandy, and scotch. Beer, non-alcoholic beer, which we'll talk about non-alc in a minute, and sort of how this is driving it. Also, these key categories that are showing growth: Mexican beer, that's pepper and spicy flavor, that's cinnamon, that's rye, that's spice, right? Rye is spicy. There's a lot of like spicy, hot flavors. Mezcal and tequila, all of that growth we're seeing in those categories, a lot of it has to do with the growth of the US population and the Hispanic consumer. In addition, you're starting to have better quality tequilas in the market, right? And not for nothing, but the margarita, of course, is being always the #1 selling cocktail on premise. There's a big correlation when you are eating Mexican food and you go to a Mexican restaurant, you're drinking Mexican beer and you're having margaritas. There's no other sort of food category, I think, that's so tightly entwined with the culture of a particular beverage alcohol as Mexican food, which Americans love. And there are a ton of Mexican chain restaurants, quick service restaurants, sit-down restaurants, and a lot of that is driving a lot of the growth we're seeing in the Mexican beer and the tequila, which is really interesting. And if we look specifically at tequila and horchata-based liqueurs, mezcal, just as an example to show the growth in these style of spirits by category, as well as the Mexican beer brands. So if you follow at all what's going on in the beer space, Mexican imports, so driven by Constellation Brands right now, is significantly driving what's going on in the beer category. It's hugely popular. Brands like Corona and Modelo are just outpacing the category growth. And that is really interesting because everyone always likes to talk about craft beer, craft beer, craft beer. But really the bright spot in the beer category are imports. So this thirst for experience, what does this mean? more people are drinking at home than on-premise. Okay, so this is most of us probably know this, right? So on-premise traffic, there's always a lot of this talk about how it's been going down, and a lot of it's driven by economic factors. But overall, the staying in is the new going out is really a significant trend to look at. So for years, everyone talks about how brands are built on-premise. And while that is partially true, and it depends on the brand and the category, most of the big suppliers are focusing on how to get share of mind in your house. Okay, and there's a lot of factors that are driving at-home consumption. I like to call it sort of selective social interaction. I mean, sometimes you're just like, I don't want to have to wait in line for a drink at a bar. I just want to be able to have a conversation with my friends. I think there's also a huge influx of better educated consumers, right? Everybody has an app. So they generally know how much the cost of a bottle of wine is. It becomes much harder to go out and pay 2.5 to 3 times the cost of a bottle of wine when you're at your favorite restaurant, when you know how much that wine costs. Second, the whole cocktail culture has really given rise to everyone wanting to make cocktails at home. It's now become sort of this show and tell, this ability to be able to say, hey, I'm gonna make an old fashioned at home for my friends, and I'm gonna get the ice maker and have the big cubes, and I'm gonna do the whole thing, and I'm gonna get my nice bottle of bourbon. And there's a real experience about being able to know how to make a cocktail at home, right? Because you're going out to these bars and you're paying $15 to $18 for a really good made old fashioned. And for $30, you can get a great bottle of Eagle Rare 10-year aged bourbon. And why would you not do that and have 10 drinks at home versus 1 or 2? So this whole kind of idea of experience and staying in is really kind of important. And if you look at the growth of home bars and home bartending books and the ability to open a Pottery Bar catalog or go to Home Goods, for God's sakes, and find, plastic ice cube makers, it's really prevalent everywhere. And people want to know how to make cocktails at home. There's also higher quality takeout and prepared foods. This is a really important thing to think about. Whole foods, a lot of these sweet green, there's a really great kind of takeaway or prepared foods for people to go and get really good meals and bring it home and buy a bottle of wine. So you can go and spend, and this goes back to this premiumization trend, right? You can go and spend $20 for dinner for 2 at Whole Foods and get a pretty healthy, good meal. And then also, depending on where you live, that same Whole Foods, you could probably at that point say, hey, you know what? I'm getting this, pretty good meal. I'm not going out. I'm probably saving $100. So why don't I splurge and get a $25 or a $30 bottle of wine? So the wine becomes a much more a better value proposition when you're eating at home, especially in looking at the quality of food. And then of course, home delivery, right? So we all know about delivery services. It's much easier to sit, if you live in the city, at home, cook a meal and order beverage alcohol to be delivered to your home. So all of those things are really an important part of what's going on when looking at the consumer and what their expectations are, and it's drinking at home. This chart really shows spirits and wine consumption by location, and you can see your home or someone else's home, whether it's across spirits and wine, are the 2 biggest sort of categories, right? So which means, where do I drink beverage alcohol? If I'm not, overall, most people combined are doing it at a friend's house or their house. Something really important to think about. Going on to the experience part, right? So we're continuing on from that experience at home, and now we're going to talk about the experience of connecting with brands. So this is what I like to call kind of the know thy maker. Where does my beer, wine, or spirits, or cocktail come from? Right now, we know that both between tap rooms and on-site bars, with both beer and with spirits, you can see here, it contributes to a pretty decent size of overall sales. So depending on the state, there's those farmer distillery licenses, and each state law sort of varies, but it allows most craft brewers, also this goes for winemakers and distilleries, within the state to also potentially have an on-premise license, meaning that they can serve or sell their own bottles directly. So if you go to California, this is kind of common, right? You go to California, there's a ton of wines that never make it out of California, and you just buy them on site at the winery. So now we're looking at this growth of craft spirits and craft beer, and you're seeing in every state now, there's dozens of breweries and distilleries, and now, and depending on where you live, certain wineries, where on-site sales are driving a significant amount of the business because it's cutting out the whole 3-tier system, better profits, of course, for the brewer and for the distiller, and also the biggest thing is it gives consumers an actual experience. That becomes very, very important. It really ties into this long-term trend we've seen of farmers markets, buying local, knowing where your food comes from. You can go now, I was just at Starbucks this morning, and they're promoting kind of antibiotic-free turkey and free-range eggs. I mean, all of these kind of buzzwords about where our food comes from and the quality of our food impacts beverage alcohol as well. Most people on a Saturday afternoon would much rather go to their local brewery, meet the brewer, get a tour, pick up a growler, have an experience with their friends than walk into a package store and just buy something off the shelf. This is a really important thing to think about, is the experience. And while not everybody can be a brewer or a craft distiller, how you're connecting with a consumer in terms of your authenticity and the brand message and how the consumer can really interact with the brand is a really critical part of looking at what consumers are expecting these days. So building on this, talking about craft and this craft conundrum, we did we're doing kind of continuing, this is our second year working on something called the Craft Spirits Data Project with Park Street and the ACSA, and we're looking at overall sort of the widest craft spirits study that's been done in the US. And in looking at this, we're seeing, of course, it's a huge part of what's driving a lot of spirits volume in the US, right? So it's this, we're looking at the growth of craft distilleries and what this means and how it impacts overall beverage alcohol consumption. And based on the things I was saying before about desire for experience and the ability to be in your city and supporting local and having the option to go and visit a distillery and get a tour and all those things, that really drives, that's money that people are spending on those brands instead of going to a store and purchasing other brands outside of that arena. So we're looking at the overall growth of this, and we do see that there's a lot of growth that's going to continue in the craft distillery space. What's important to think about, and this is kind of the takeaway from this craft has different meanings depending on who you ask. Okay, so a lot of trade organizations have different meanings on craft. Consumers have a very different opinion on craft. And we asked consumers unaided craft brand mentions. We said, tell us a craft brand that you've had. You can see here Hennessy, Del Maguey, Patron, and frankly, some of these brands, if you ask any mezcal producer, they would argue, well, my brand is craft. It's artisanal. It's handmade. I spend time roasting my agave, and it's an authentic experience. If you ask cognac makers in France, if you ask scotch makers, they're all going to say globally, when I talk to our analysts globally and say, what does craft mean in Australia and what does craft mean in France, you're going to get very different answers on what craft means, because to some people it means artisanal. It means time-honored methods. It means care in how you're making a product. So using that terminology can actually mean a lot of different things, and there can be a lot of categories that make sense with craft. So it's very hard when you think about hanging your hat on the term craft with a consumer unless there's really that experience that's being tied to it, meaning that you're a craft distiller and you're really connecting with the consumer that way versus it being kind of an overused word, because a lot of consumers don't necessarily understand what that means. It has to do with that brand story. And there's a lot of these brands up here that have done a very good job in communicating authenticity. And if you communicate authenticity, authenticity in turn to a consumer means an element of craft. So let's talk about convenience and alternative packaging. So this is one of my favorite things to talk about because I think it's pretty cool, very exciting. People don't really care very much anymore about bottles. They still like bottles, and most of our business is going to be based on bottles, but they're much more open to drinking different types of packaging, cans, boxes, Tetra Paks. It's a big trend, and I think that it's something that's worth paying attention to. Consumers expect brands to fit in their lifestyle, and if it's inconvenient for them to bring a bottle on their boat or at a picnic or anywhere where it doesn't really make sense, and you can give them a more convenient way of taking cans to the beach, especially canned wine, then you're winning a loyal consumer because you're thinking more about how does this brand fit into their lifestyle and how can I make it so my consumers become kind of endeared or thinking about me when they're moving and their lifestyle becomes very active. We have seen a lot of higher quality spirits wines, of course, and the craft beer, I think we have to thank for the use of cans. And people really don't have a problem. There's good wine in cans. It's not something that there's an immediate reaction to where people think, well, this is not going to be good. And same thing with boxed wine. You saw earlier how the growth of the boxed wines is continuing upward and upward. It is no longer kind of that mother-in-law thing where you're like, my mother-in-law drinks boxed wine. It's really not anymore. It's everybody's drinking boxed wine, and boxed wine makes a lot of sense for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. And I would continue to see this. I mean, Fireball did their Firebox, which was two, I think, 1.5 liter pouches, and it was meant for tailgating season. So it was a way of looking at how can we capture the consumer who we know likes to drink Fireball, who can't bring glass into tailgating. Fireball is a shot occasion where people are drinking it, they're doing it in groups, it's a shareable occasion. How do we create something that's portable, that fits within a season, that makes sense, where people are buying a ton of our product? And they came up with this Firebox, and it was really pretty a smart thing to do. Seeing a lot of canned cocktails. So on this trend of more people wanting to buy and drink cocktails, canned cocktails at a higher quality versus some of the RTDs we're all used to are happening. The Slow and Low is a rock and rye. It's a great kind of 100 ml can of an old-fashioned riff that's great. And of course the canned wines, we're seeing this growing significantly. But alternative packaging, you can see the growth by package size. It's pretty significant when you're looking at even spirits, the 50 ml sizes. People want to try things. They want to be able to try them easily. They want to be able to bring them with them. And they want to be able to kind of have and not commit to anything that is something maybe they haven't tried. So small sizes work great for a lot of new emerging brands. So I wouldn't count that out, especially if you're on the spirit side of looking at 50 mLs. And then with wines especially, it's this, how do I have, if I want to have a single serve of wine and take it with me. And just wrapping up in the last couple of slides here, healthy living. So this is interesting. So this societal shift towards betterment. So this is that convergence of knowing where your food and drink comes from, but also having an experience. And it has to do with this farm to table, the farm to glass, right? We know the juicing trend, things that are house-made. You can't walk into a bar now without them saying, would you like to try our house-made bitters? Would you like to try our house-made tonics? Would you like to look, I mean, house-made is coming off the food trend, the kitchen cocktails. And overall, this kind of idea of underindulgence is a little bit sexier, right? We know the dry January phenomenon that happened. It was kind of a badge to say, well, I'm not drinking in January, right? I'm kind of gonna take January off. It's this healthy lifestyle thing. And globally, we're seeing non-alcoholic bars and the concept of sort of not drinking on the rise, where people want to have an experience. So I like to call this sort of how Starbucks was a third place, this idea of this fourth place of being a bar, but also having the experience of having a really cool handmade drink with fresh juices and fresh mixers and a great garnish that's non-alcoholic. I see more and more, and I travel a lot at bars, zero proof sections on menus, non-alcoholic cocktails. And I see a lot of people who are drinkers who just maybe say, hey, it's Monday, I'm getting up early, but I don't want to miss out on the experience of sitting in a bar and a cool atmosphere and having something that's really, looks pretty and tastes good. I don't want to miss out on the cocktail experience just because I don't feel like drinking today. So this is what is kind of the what to drink when you're not drinking phenomenon. When we've all been there, there's a lot of products that are coming out right now. I would say the alcoholic spiked seltzers are a really great example of what's happening in this space, where you're getting something that is going off the sparkling water flavored trend that seems very light, it's healthy, it's zero carb, it's gluten-free, and it's low alcohol. So you can have a couple at the beach for the day and still sort of participate in an experience of day drinking without completely, getting drunk or not feeling well, or especially if you're watching your children, you might want to just be able to have a couple of, of drinks. I mean, I think that's a thing that you're seeing a huge growth in terms of the spiked seltzers. And then the low alcohol aperitif culture. Campari has done a great job both with the Aperol Spritz and Campari in terms of looking at this Italian aperitif culture, and people are sort of really paying attention to ABV now in a way that they didn't used to, which is low ABV cocktails, which you see at cocktail menus, and then just overall non-alcoholic products. There's a plant-based non-alcoholic spirit in London called Seedlip that's out. Budweiser's making a prohibition beer. You saw earlier the Hispanic consumer drinks a lot of non-alcoholic beers. They use a lot for mixing. So I would pay attention to this, what we're seeing is this low no alcohol product or zero proof is a really big trend. And then just to wrap things up as kind of a quick kind of game plan on looking at some of these key points. These are just a few quick bullets and I won't read them all off, but overall those 6 underlying consumption drivers, they're all tying together, right? So a lot of it has to do with consumer experience, consumers being more educated, consumers knowing where things come from, wanting authenticity, paying attention to labels and price and all of these different things. So overall, paying attention to this is a big part of all these drivers that we're seeing across the board with beverage alcohol. I think that is my last slide. So I know we're running a little bit late. So what I'm going to do is just wrap up and hand it off to the next speaker. That's my email address is Brandy at the IWSR. If there's any questions, feel free to drop me a note. But thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it and enjoy the rest of the show.